All right, kiddos. We're going to start by looking at the Revolutionary War. And we looked at the very beginnings of the Revolutionary War in our previous unit. And now we're starting the actual war with the British invasion of New York. All right, so let's get this thing fired up. I'm going to try to keep this thing under 15 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. We're looking at the British invasion of the colonies. All right. Following the Battle of Bunker Hill and some of the subsequent skirmishes after that between the militia and the British soldiers who were in the colonies, the British are going to send more soldiers to the colonies and attempt to put down this rebellion that the colonists have started. So their plan is to take New York. They chose New York because, if you remember, the revolution started up in the New England colonies. It started in Massachusetts. And so the British want to land south of Massachusetts and cut the New England colonies off from the rest of the 13 colonies. Okay? The reason that they want to do this is they think that most of the patriots are going to be in the New England colonies, and they feel like most of the loyalists are in the southern colonies. So if they can cut the colonies, excuse me, if they can cut the colonies in half and isolate New England, they can put the rebellion down a little quicker. So again, the plan is to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies so that they can quell this rebellion. All right. So to do this, they're going to invade New York. The man in charge of this invasion for the British is a guy named General William Howe. And he is a very successful British general. Every time he fights against George Washington, he beats George Washington. The only thing that's going to defeat William Howe is William Howe. And we're going to see why in just a little bit. He had 32,000 British soldiers under his command when he landed in New York. George Washington, on the other hand, oh, and let me say this, General William Howe had 32,000 well-trained British soldiers at his command. Compare that to George Washington. George Washington had 23,000 American soldiers who were not well-trained. Okay? The British soldiers were part of the greatest army in the world at that time. George Washington's American soldiers were poorly trained, hastily called up in defense of this rebellion that had been started. So, not surprisingly, in New York, Howe crushed the Americans and forced them to retreat. But General Howe is not going to pursue the American army. Okay, and a lot of people say that this was one of the biggest mistakes of the war for England, that they could have ended everything right here if Howe had just pursued Washington. But he didn't pursue Washington. Instead, he secured New York and then went to Philadelphia and partied it up in Philadelphia, right? So what is it that could have held a man's attention so much that he abandoned defeating his enemy? Well, the answer is a woman, okay? A lot of historians say that Elizabeth Loring is one of the reasons that William Howe didn't pursue Washington and one of the reasons that the British are going to lose this war. All right. If you see this little poem that was written by Francis Hopkinson, who also signed the Declaration of Independence, this poem is making fun of William Howe and Elizabeth Loring. Part of the poem says, "Sir William he, snug as a flea, lay all this time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring." He was having an affair with Elizabeth Loring. Now, this has caused a lot of people to ask the question, was Elizabeth Loring a loyalist who was just lusting after William Howe because of the lifestyle that it provided for her? Because you got to understand that she was a married woman. Howe was a married man, but Elizabeth Loring was a married woman, and her husband served in the British Army. So this is like she's having an affair with her husband's boss. A lot of people say that she was a loyalist and she just enjoyed the lifestyle that staying in close with the general provided for her and her husband. Some people say she was a patriot. that she was sleeping with William Howe on purpose to delay his advance and help the Patriot Army regroup. I'm not here to speculate which one. I'm going to leave that up to you guys, but it's pretty interesting to think about. All right, so following the invasion of New York, George Washington's back is against the wall. Okay, he's running away from the British. He's been pushed all the way to Delaware. Most of his men have been captured or they had run away from the army, and he's got less than 8,000 men left. Of those 8,000 men, most of their contracts were up at the end of the year. So he's a breath away from losing this war, and he realizes it. He knows that when your back is against the wall, you've got to do something desperate. And that's what he does. Washington decided a very risky attack on the British, a surprise attack, to gain important victories. The first of which was the Battle of Trenton. He crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, with 2,400 men and launched a surprise attack against German Hessians at Trenton. And they win. You've probably seen this picture before. This is the painting that people have used to romanticize George Washington crossing the Delaware River Christmas night. Now, I would highly doubt that this is actually what things looked like that night, but you know how artists' pictures go. They always want to glorify things to a ridiculous point. But by crossing the icy Delaware River, George Washington was able to launch a surprise attack against the German Hessians. Now, another point to this is a lot of people say that the Germans were celebrating Christmas, drinking heavily, and that when George Washington showed up, most of them were too drunk to fight. That's not historically accurate, okay? They just, George Washington just did a really good job of launching a surprise attack and catching them off guard. He captured over 900 Hessians and 6 cannons in the attack on Trenton. 8 days later, he achieved another victory at the Battle of Princeton against 1,200 British soldiers. So now George Washington has secured a couple of victories, which is important going into the winter of that year. It raises the morale of his soldiers, gets a lot of them to re-enlist, just humongous victories for the country. The British, meanwhile, are invading Philadelphia, and George Washington couldn't do much about it. He tried to stop the invasion by battling the British at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, but was unsuccessful. Now, why should this be ringing a bell for you? Well, it should be ringing a bell in your head because Philadelphia is the capital of this new country that we have formed, the United States. The Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. So if the British capture Philadelphia and capture the Continental Congress, that might be the end of the war. So George Washington at least slows the British down at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, but is forced to retreat, and the British capture Philadelphia. Luckily, the Continental Congress had fled the city, so the war could continue. But Howe once again failed to pursue the Americans and instead settled in and enjoyed the hospitality of the city's loyalist population. He's partying it up in Philadelphia. He's getting fed good. He's having people treat him to parties and dinners and giving him drinks and just, living it up. And because of this, the British are going to suffer their worst loss of the war. All right? This is going to teach all you guys a lesson about having partners that are more interested in their social life than they are the important things. All right? So let's look at what happened. John Burgoyne was a British general who was up in British Canada. And he wanted to march down from Canada to meet Howe's forces in New York. Now, remember, Howe is partying it up in Philadelphia. He's not going anywhere. So as John Burgoyne starts marching south from Canada, Howe is staying put in Philadelphia. Okay? the Patriots find out about this, okay? And Burgoyne is also slowed down by the terrain in which he's marching over. All right, so we have a slow-moving General John Burgoyne and a not moving General William Howe, right? This is going to be trouble for the British. When the Americans find out that he was marching south, meaning when Burgoyne was marching south, the American General Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, and Ethan Allen all converged on Burgoyne and captured over 5,000 British soldiers at the Battle of Saratoga. Okay? This battle is what we call a turning point. We've talked about this before, but a turning point in a war is a very, very important victory where one side starts to win the war. Before Saratoga, things were looking pretty bleak for the Americans, but after Saratoga, things are looking pretty good because the American victory at Saratoga convinces the French that the Americans can actually win this war, and the French agree to help us. Okay? Now, one other thing I want to point out before we move on, I said that there were 3 American generals that captured John Burgoyne's men at the Battle of Saratoga, and that was Horatio Gates, which we'll talk more about later, Ethan Allen, and Benedict Arnold. Now, Benedict Arnold is an important historical figure because he's the most famous traitor in history. Okay? He starts out on the side of the Americans. He's a pretty good general. He helps capture Saratoga, or capture the British soldiers at Saratoga. And then he's going to become a turncoat and he's going to switch sides. The reason he's going to switch sides is simple, petty pride and greed. So let's look at it. So Saratoga is important because it secured help from the French, who were convinced that an American victory was possible. And remember, the French don't like the British anyway. And it's also important because in the aftermath of the victory, petty tension between Horatio Gates, who's going to take all the credit for Saratoga, Benedict Arnold gets jealous that Horatio Gates has taken all the credit, and Arnold will betray his country because he's passed over for promotions and credit that he feels like he deserves. Okay? Here we have some pictures of Benedict Arnold. Starts out as a blue coat, ends up as a red coat. All right, so Arnold's spat with Gates was just the beginning. Again, he was passed over for promotion after promotion, and he became bitter. Now, when people become bitter, they do things that are not logical. And so he got greedy, and he started using his military position to increase his financial gain. And so he was court-martialed, brought up on trial for that. He continued to get bitter and bitter and bitter, and then he married Peggy Shippen. Peggy Shippen was the daughter of a loyalist. Remember, what's a loyalist? A loyalist is an American colonist who wants to stay with the British. They don't want this war for American independence. They want the British to stay in charge. And shortly after he married Peggy Shippen, he starts, she gets in his ear a little bit, and he starts plotting to betray his country. All right? She keeps saying, hey, you've been passed over for these promotions. You've been court-martialed, and you're an American hero. You shouldn't put up with this anymore. So when he was given command of West Point, which is, of course, the military academy, he decides to hand over West Point to the British. He decides that he is going to let the British come in and take West Point, okay, which would have been devastating for the Americans. But his plot is discovered, okay? And so he jumps ship and gets on a British ship called the HMS Vulture to get out of America to escape the justice of betraying his country. All right. Fast forward to George Washington and Valley Forge, the famous Valley Forge. where George Washington was able to finally properly train his troops with the help of some foreign born military minds. All right. The winter of 1777-1778 was a harsh winter. Valley Forge was not a fun place to be. This was a camp where the American soldiers were able to finally rest and train. But it was bitter cold, there wasn't enough food, and people are going to die from exposure to the cold, from sickness, from disease. It's not a good time, but it is an opportunity to train the soldiers. So when they get the opportunity to camp, they camp at Valley Forge. Conditions are miserable, but with the help of Baron Friedrich von Steuben and Marquis de Lafayette, Washington was able to properly train his men. Von Steuben was a Prussian general who had been dishonorably discharged from the military, and Marquis de Lafayette was a Frenchman who both helped to train the American infantry. Okay, von Steuben helped them learning how to march using their bayonets, and his famous quote is that he vowed to make regular soldiers out of country bumpkins. All right, so von Steuben vowed to make regular soldiers out of country bumpkins. I love that quote. Here we have a picture of Valley Forge. You can see the snow on the ground, people trying to stay warm, and this was probably making things look a lot better than they actually were. We'll pick up there on the next video, guys, with the Americans coming out of Valley Forge being properly trained and having help from the French because of their victory at Saratoga.